Today, we're dissecting the anatomy of evil, exploring what medicine reveals about the minds of 5 of history's most infamous killers. Not to glorify them, but to dissect them from a medical standpoint. All right, let's dive right in. Number 5, Ed Gein, the Butcher of Plainfield. 1957, Plainfield, Wisconsin. Police stepped into a farmhouse that looks like a scene from a nightmare. Furniture and lampshades made from human skin. This is Ed Gein, the man who would later inspire Psycho's Norman Bates, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre's Leatherface, and the Silence of the Lambs' Buffalo Bill. But medically speaking, Ed Gein wasn't a sadistic mastermind. He was psychotically ill. Gein grew up isolated under an abusive, religiously fanatical mother who preached that women were evil. And after her death, his fragile grip on reality fractured completely. He began exhuming bodies from local cemeteries, literally digging up the recently deceased, often women who reminded him of his mother. In his delusional state, he believed that he could bring her back, or at least preserve part of her presence. What followed were the tributes he made, grotesque attempts to recreate her image and environment. He tanned human skin to make masks and clothing, crafted household items from bone, and even assembled what he called a woman's suit. From a psychological and medical standpoint, this behavior reflects grave psychosis with maternal fixation, what we now recognize as a form of dissociative identity confusion, where grief, guilt, and delusion merge into a ritualistic compulsion. But his delusions escalated. When grave robbing no longer fulfilled his compulsion, Gein murdered 2 women, tavern owner Mary Hogan in 1954 and hardware store owner Bernice Worden in 1957. Both killings showed sudden, targeted violence and ritualistic aftermath, suggesting the act itself wasn't driven by rage, but by psychosis. Gein's acts weren't born from sadism or hatred. They were born from psychosis, most likely a delusional effort to connect with the only person he'd ever truly loved, his mother. Number 4, Jeffrey Dahmer, the cannibal compulsion. 1991, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Police open a refrigerator and find preserved human remains carefully arranged and labeled like leftovers. This was Jeffrey Dahmer, a man who appeared quiet, polite, and ordinary to his neighbors. He was just the soft-spoken guy down the hall. But behind the calm exterior lived one of the most chilling compulsions in modern criminal history. From a medical and psychological standpoint, Dahmer's crimes stemmed from a blend of paraphilic disorder, necrophilia, and deep emotional detachment. He sought not violence for his own sake, but possession, or a total control over another human being. Dahmer often met his victims in bars or on the street, many of them young men who he lured home under the pretense of photography or companionship. Between 1978 and 1991, Dahmer murdered 17 young men and boys. But he wasn't charming in the theatrical sense like Ted Bundy. His terrifying power came from the trust, the quiet confidence of someone who seemed to be safe. That's what made him so dangerous. In his own words, he wanted to keep them forever, reflecting obsessive attachment over his victims, where love, fear of abandonment, and domination fuse into one distorted desire. Neurologically, dysfunction in the temporal lobe and amygdala are likely to blame, regions responsible for emotional regulation and empathy, which dysfunction here may have blunted his compassion while heightening reward circuits tied to control and death, according to experts. Forensic examinations later revealed that many of his victims died from blunt force trauma and strangulation, injuries that in an ER setting we often see and can cause rapid cerebral hypoxia and death within minutes, sadly. To forensic pathologists, that combination often reflects deliberate control, not chaos, but anatomical precision. Number 3, Ted Bundy, the Charmer. 1974, Seattle, Washington. A young woman disappears from a crowded campus in broad daylight after being approached by a polite man with a cast on his arm, asking for help carrying books to his car. This wasn't an unusual story for Bundy. In fact, this was his signature move. He used charm and perceived vulnerability as camouflage, pretending to be injured or a local authority to disarm potential victims and gain their trust. Bundy seemed like the definition of put together, on paper that is. He was a law student, volunteered at a suicide hotline, and carried himself with charisma and confidence. But beneath that polished exterior, there was an emotional vacancy, a neurological void that allowed him to imitate empathy without ever actually feeling it. From a psychiatric and neurological standpoint, Bundy fit the classic profile of a high-functioning psychopath. Functional MRI studies in similar offenders show reduced activity in the orbital frontal cortex, the part of the brain that controls impulse inhibition, and weak connectivity between the amygdala, which processes emotion, and the prefrontal cortex, which interprets morality. Disconnection means Bundy could read emotional cues and mimic human warmth, but none of it registered internally. Bundy's compulsions didn't end at murder. He returned to the crime scenes, photographed victims, and sometimes revisited their remains. Behavior consistent with paraphilic control disorder, where dominance and possession replaced intimacy. Psychologically, these acts reinforced his illusion of power and control, the one emotion he could actually feel. Ted Bundy smiled in the daylight, proof that evil doesn't always look dangerous. Rather, sometimes it looks confident, magnetic, and perfectly sane. Number 2, Richard Chase, the Vampire of Sacramento. 1978, Sacramento, California. Police enter a modest apartment after reports of a missing woman. What they find looks less like a crime scene and more like a medical autopsy gone wrong. Blood pooled on the floor, dismembered remains, and a refrigerator filled with human organs. The man responsible was Richard Chase. But what makes Chase's case stand out isn't just the brutality, it's the biology behind it. This was a man whose descent into violence was not driven by greed or control, but by a pure chaotic storm of delusion and disease. Chase suffered from paranoid schizophrenia, a severe psychiatric disorder marked by hallucinations, disorganized thinking, and delusional beliefs. In his case, those delusions took a terrifying form because he believed his blood was turning to dust and that his heart was shrinking. And he was convinced that drinking blood from animals at first and later from humans was the only way to keep himself alive. From a medical standpoint, Chase also suffered from extreme malnutrition and iron deficiency anemia, conditions that can cause weakness, fatigue, and even cognitive decline. Combined with heavy amphetamine use, his already fragile mental state deteriorated into complete psychosis. Experts believe his behavior fits a profile of delusional parasitosis and clinical vampirism, rare disorders where the brain misinterprets internal sensations as life-threatening bodily decay, driving compulsive ritualistic behavior. Over the span of just 1 month, Chase murdered 6 people, and his crimes followed no pattern of logic or planning, only escalating paranoia and compulsion. Forensic pathologists later found that his victims suffered multiple stab wounds, massive blood loss, and post-mortem organ removal. Number 1, Aileen Wuornos, The Traumatic Pathway, Florida, late 1980s. Bodies begin appearing along desolate highways. All men, all shot at close range. And the killer wasn't who anyone expected. It was a woman, Aileen Wuornos, a former sex worker who claimed every killing was an act of self-defense. Between 1989 and 1990, Wuornos murdered 7 men, often after picking them up while hitchhiking or working along the I-75 corridor. She later said each male encounter turned violent, that she only shot to survive. But investigators found a different story, written in ballistics and autopsy reports. A pattern of controlled, repetitive, execution-style gunshots. From a medical and psychiatric standpoint, Aileen Wuornos is a case study in what lifelong trauma can do to the human brain. Her history reads like a textbook on complex post-traumatic stress, abandoned at birth, sexually abused by relatives, and homeless by adolescence. Over years of repeated trauma, her amygdala, the brain's threat detector, likely became hyperactive, while her prefrontal cortex showed classic signs of dysfunction. So when Wuornos claimed she snapped, that wasn't metaphorical. Physiologically, her brain was primed to perceive danger even when none existed. She may not have been a calculated killer in the classic sense. She was hyperreactive in a product of sustained neurochemical trauma. Wuornos' crimes sit in a gray area between reactive violence and psychopathy. She displayed emotional instability, dissociation, and paranoia, hallmarks of borderline personality disorder compounded by complex PTSD. Her violence wasn't fueled by pleasure or sadism, but by perceived survival. What ties all of these cases together isn't just cruelty, it's dysfunction. But understanding these patterns isn't about excusing evils. It's about trying to prevent it from a medical and social standpoint. Are there any other serial killers you'd like to learn about, or maybe even popular figures in history? Let me know in the comments below. And if you found this episode thought-provoking, make sure you click on this playlist right here for more deep dives into the intersection of medicine, psychology, and the dark side of human behavior. And please do me a favor and smack that subscribe button, turn on your bell notifications, and hit that like button so we can keep making more videos like this one. Thank you so much for watching, and stay healthy, my friends.